Howdy y'all, it's Curious Raven, back on this Tuesday with a mix of paranormal spooky stories. I hope y'all enjoy them. Number 1. I used to be a long life skeptic. I don't believe in the supernatural and God or anything like that. And although it sounds cliche, since I've been living in the colonial city of Querétaro, I've started to have my doubts, seriously. It all began when we went to explore the back of my friend's house, who owns a restaurant. In the center of the city, all the houses are old, and this house was no exception. My friend, 2 other friends, and I went there. Suddenly, my friend and one of the friends stayed at the threshold of one of the doors. I asked them what was wrong, and they both claimed with a weird look on their face that there were ghosts in there. I scoffed at them, telling them they were crazy, and continued on. I didn't see or feel anything. They both insisted that they felt something. I guess because they are empathetic to the paranormal, which I recently learned. Every time I wanted to go to that place for dinner, my friend would refuse. She said there was very negative energy there. I went back many times and nothing happened. The only thing I could witness with my own eyes was during a New Year's party we celebrated there. 3 of my friends were surprised by something. I saw how a strand of one of their curly hair oddly remained horizontal. I didn't think anything of it. In fact, I found it funny. They just laughed nervously. And that was the only thing that happened that day. Now that I remember, it was surprising, but I remained in denial. Sometime later, when I had the chance, I asked the owners of the house if they had also seen or felt anything strange. They replied that they personally hadn't. The only incident was when they were renovating the bottom floor of the house, and they unearthed a tombstone with more than 100 years of history. Beneath what they say was the printing press of the convent of La Cruz. They also told me that many customers and employees of their restaurant had made comments about something or someone lurking in that part of the house. The only concrete story came from a kitchen assistant who told me that he had seen a little girl, and he was really scared, to the point of quitting that job. A few years passed, and I liked to visit a downtown craft beer bar at nighttime. I chatted with the bartender at the bar while talking about craft beer most of the time. One time, the topic came up. He told me that almost when it was closing time around 2:30 a.m., he saw a man leaning against the wall next to one of the refrigerators at the entrance. There as if he were drunk. He wasn't a real person. He said that the apparition didn't speak or do anything. It just appeared there. Obviously, I didn't believe him. 6 years after moving to the city, my friend accompanied me to another craft beer place, also located in the downtown area of the city. We had an event, and after it ended, she sat alone at one of the tables while I went to greet and chat with other attendees and friends. Suddenly, she called me and asked me to please leave. She was very insistent. I asked her why, and she replied that she felt a ghost and that it had actually pushed her and moved the bench. I reluctantly agreed, not without telling her she was overreacting. Some time passed, and I went back to that beer bar. Sometimes I chatted with the owner and sometimes the waiter. One time I asked the waiter if there were any ghost stories there, and he said yes. I let him tell me whatever he wanted without specific questions. He didn't give me any details, but he said that it used to be an old-style tavern, cantina in Spanish. And in the back room where my friend said she was pushed, there was a ghost woman, most likely a prostitute. She probably was there because she had been murdered there. It was that day and that moment when I started to believe people who claim to see and feel ghosts. Now I genuinely fear that I might perceive them someday. I feel it now as I write this. Number 2. Hello, this is my first post on the subreddit because I am relatively new to Reddit. I'm a little confused right now. Over the years, I have noticed strange occurrences, with some being related to spirits and ghosts of the sort. and other times I've just been a little too paranoid. However, as of late, I have felt like my surroundings are empty, despite being at college and surrounded by people. I feel like there is a recent lack of any paranormal occurrences or anything related to spirits nearby. It's almost like everything just vanished and is unsettling to say the least. I understand that while I am sometimes skeptical of spirits, this was one thing that I always felt was there and real, but it seems almost abandoned. Like I'm at college full of people, but how can there be no spirits? It might just be me, but something seems very wrong with that. I was looking through some posts and found that some people may deal with hauntings or possessions. So maybe something left my side. Any information on if there is anything that I could do would be great. Number 3. About 6 years ago, when I was 13, my family and I moved into the home of a family friend whose parents had passed away a few years prior. We all recently moved out once my dad got a job offer across the state, and I moved out on my own. The layout of the portion of the home this takes place in is difficult to describe, and I don't have really any photos that show the whole area. So I'm going to try my best to paint a picture here. The living room used to be what I would assume to be the dining room at one point in time. The whole room was long and open, besides a wall that divided the galley kitchen and the now living room, and the wall stopped about 3/4 of the width of the room. Past the galley kitchen, where there was a small breakfast nook, was the hallway that led to a washer and dryer and the door to the garage. If you stood in the middle of the room, you could see straight down that hallway. Above the sink in the kitchen, there was a small cutout that allowed you to see straight into the living room. Hung up high on a fireplace was a large TV, which you could see from the sink or the breakfast nook, and if it was off, it would reflect the hallway perfectly. The first time I have ever had this experience was probably about 2 years into my family living there. I was doing dishes at the sink, and I can remember looking up and catching the glimpse of someone in the hallway in the TV. I stared at it for a moment, trying to make out if it was the friend or a family member. But the more I stared at it, I realized it was none of them. Whatever or whoever the figure was tall and slender and visibly female from what I could make out. Every inch of the being was dark and almost void, but I could tell there was a hair falling down the side of its shoulders. For context, I am 5'4", and I was probably a little shorter at this time. My mother is 5'3", but this thing was clearly taller than me. I wouldn't call myself a skeptic, but also the kind of person who needs to fully debunk anything it could be before I truly start to believe it. So being curious and mustering enough courage to glance down the hallway, but to my surprise, there was nothing there. It was like it had completely disappeared. But whenever I glanced back at the TV, I could see it standing behind me. Back and forth ensued with me trying to figure out why I could only see it in the TV, and many attempts to try to look around and find anything that could be making this shape or figure out of thin air. I came up with nothing. Let's just say I didn't finish the dishes. For years, I would glance up and continue to see this same figure standing in the darkness of the TV, but every time I glanced over at the hallway, nothing. After some time, I became used to seeing it. She never moved, never made anything else move, and she never made a sound. She just stood there. So knowing there was no harm in ignoring it, I did just that. My parents never mentioned seeing anything. So I honestly started to believe my anxious brain was just creating things out of thin air, and I kind of completely forgot about it. My boyfriend and I started dating a few months before I moved out, and he had been over regularly and even spent the night on the weekends sometimes. We were exchanging ghost stories from our childhood, which most of mine took place in the previous home my family lived in. when I started to bring up this recurring encounter. Before I even had the chance to mention the TV aspect, my boyfriend suddenly became pale in the face and mentioned the TV. I followed up by asking him how he knew that because I hadn't ever mentioned it. He told me that he had gone into the kitchen to grab a drink one night and felt like he was being watched, and when he glanced up, he noticed something in the TV. I started to freak out, suddenly realized that I wasn't the only one to see it. He described everything about the figure to a point, the hair, and the height, and the position. Everything. What makes it weirder was that he only able to see her over his shoulder, making him feel like she was standing flush up against him. He only saw her once and never again, unlike me who had seen her so often that it was normal to me. I called my sister and father to ask them if they've ever seen it, but they both replied no. Also had some weird encounters of their own in different places of the house, meaning that for right now, as far as I'm aware, me and my boyfriend are the only two to have ever seen her, which makes this even more confusing. Number 4. Last night, December 15th, my grandma passed at 10 p.m. EST, India time, around 8 a.m. December 16th. I've missed almost all family funerals due to expenses, and the body is never held for longer than a day before cremation because of my family's choice in India. I've missed my grandpas, my aunts, and my grandmothers, all on my father's side, due to living in the U.S. Since I found out late last night, around 11 p.m., the thought of forgive me echoed in my head a million times as I sobbed uncontrollably. I just needed one sign to know she's forgiven me for not being able to make it yet to another funeral. I then called my dad to tell him what happened early morning of the 15th. Not sure it was related, but I had a dream. I dream a lot. I share especially when following events are strange. But since I moved into my new home, I've been here for 9 months. I never have any scary, uncomfortable dreams or other paranormal experiences, as I usually do in the hotels and in older places. Anyway, in my dream, I saw a woman float into my bedroom, a dead bride. Kinda weird, like a typical movie. And as I'm trying to get my husband's attention to tell him about this intruder, I get up to stop her. As I do, I get up from the dream. Naturally, I get very scared at night, especially due to nightmares. So I breathe heavy, wake up my husband, and I am unable to sleep throughout the night. I wake up the morning of the 15th for a doctor's appointment. As I drive to it, I think of how lonely this woman felt. Anyway, I was telling my dad this dream. Recall my TV went off, audio only. This has never happened to me before. My husband and I were on the couch, FaceTiming my dad. Both remotes were on the table. Nobody touched or sat on them. I usually have a sixth sense of things, but never would have predicted the passing of my grandma. Like a couple weeks ago, I had a dream my parents got into an accident, but they were both fine. That morning, right as I woke up, my mom called me and said Dad is feeling like he's having a heart attack. In the end, with God's grace, he was all okay. And it was all an accident, technically. My grandma lost her husband about a decade ago. Her daughter, who's my aunt, a little more than a decade ago. She always felt very lonely. She lived with my other aunt, but I knew she was very lonely and not happiest. Anyway, the TV audio turning on. I like to believe she gave me a sign.
I live inside my own world of make-believe. Kids screaming in the cradles, profanities. I see the world through ice covered in ink and bleach. Cross